The Industrial Revolution initially is horrible for everyone who's involved. In the core of Britain, you have both a drop in human height, you have a drop in life expectancy, and you have these horrendous stories of children dying en masse in these factories, which are often referred to as satanic mills, with good reason. It isn't until you start to get these big social movements, suffragettes, unionists, even anarchists, who push for things like the 8-hour working day, the 40-hour week. Suddenly, you start to get change. That's when you start to see the liftoff of all these different big indicators. That tells a very different story to the typical hockey stick. It's not one of hierarchy and technology equals progress. Quite to the contrary, technology, most of the benefits have usually been eaten up by a small elite across history. Instead, you start to get shared prosperity when you have essentially both social movements that demand change, that demand for the fruits of technology to be widely shared, and of course, yes, you do have some technological change in a positive direction.
Those things. So when one thing changes, another thing changes.
The gross national product does not allow the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play.
In what way might economists' flawed understanding of risk be driving the many crises we face today? For the latest episode of Invisible Handcuffs, I was delighted to be joined by Luke Kemp, research affiliate at the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and author of the best-selling, critically acclaimed book, Goliath's Curse, The History and Future of Societal Collapse. You might be thinking, this is a series about economics, so why am I talking to an expert on existential risk? Well, there are a couple of reasons, but one is that Luke actually trained and worked as a climate economist. Indeed, he was drawn to researching civilisational collapse when he saw that climate economic models were tending to look only at average trajectories and not at so-called tail risks. These are the worst case outcomes which may have a smaller probability, but which could be potentially catastrophic, but we're not planning for them. But then to understand civilisational risk, he realised he had to define what civilisations actually are. And this is where I think his work actually becomes most relevant for understanding the ways in which economics is going wrong today and how we might be able to fix it. Many of us, not just economists, have this kind of Hobbesian view of progress. The idea that life was nasty, brutish and short until the civilising force of states and empires came and liberated us. But when Luke started to dig into these periods, he found contradictory evidence. Rather than being times of human flourishing, health and well-being actually tends to fall overall, while environmental degradation, resource depletion, inflation, violence, inequality all tend to rise. So these were not really civil times in the sense that we might understand the word today, but structured around what Luke terms dominance hierarchies. Dominance of humans over nature, of men over women, rich over poor, master over slave. It might have been good for elites who got to hoard all the wealth and power, build their palaces and whatnot, but not the broader population. Indeed, when these empires fall, most people tend to be better off. Hence, Luke developed his preferred term, Goliaths. Well, today, Luke claims we're living in a global Goliath, the period that effectively started with the Industrial Revolution. And this is where we make the link with economics, because as I discussed with Luke, much of economics takes this kind of hockey stick view of human progress. It's effectively starting a few hundred years ago with industrialization, which led to this massive expansion in the global economy, in wealth and so-called progress. But again, that's not the whole story. In my earlier discussion with economist Dave Keane, we talked about how economists' obsession with innovation as the key driver of growth overlooked that all technology requires energy. And part of the clue to why economists ignored and continued to ignore energy and nature stems from the idea that we can dominate nature, as well as a view of history that was effectively written by elites who have benefited from the innovation and growth. So what Luke is saying is not only do such models ignore nature, but they also ignore the social movements so critical to ensuring that innovation benefits people more broadly. And they also ignore the externalities because each new innovation brings new problems. I'm currently sitting in Europe where we're in our 5th heat wave and we're experiencing crop failures directly tied to our energy systems and the fertilizers used in agricultural production, which produce the greenhouse gases that are causing the warming in the first place. And yet today we still have economic models betting on innovation literally written into their production functions as the core driver of growth, with growth overall still deemed necessary and necessarily good, ignoring who benefits from that growth and the risks that it is stoking. Not least of those is AI, which, as we come to near the end of the conversation, is the area of risk that Luke is now focusing on. And once again, we tend to see economists, blind to history, blind to nature, and blind to those externalities and feedbacks, being most bullish about AI. As Luke puts it, effectively justifying the dreams of tech billionaires, even if the outcomes, if we ignore the risks, could be truly catastrophic. If we want to have an economy that works for all, we need an economics that can factor in risks, that has a more nuanced understanding of progress, one that defines progress as genuine well-being for all, not just more wealth for elites, and that appreciates and supports the vital role of democratic movements. This was a fascinating conversation. I do hope you will give it a listen, and if you want to learn more, you can find links to the show notes, plus all of our earlier episodes, as well as my essay series at invisiblehandcuffs.com. With that, please join me in welcoming climate economist turned existential risk expert, Luke Kemp. Hi, Luke. Welcome to Invisible Handcuffs. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Katie, and thank you for having me.
We've been talking a little bit offline about how we have, I think, a kind of a somewhat similar intro to this topic. Your book, Goliath's Curse, which we'll get into shortly, is essentially about collapse of civilizations, collapse of empires. And I was also introduced to this topic of collapse when I first came across The Limits to Growth, which kind of sent me on the path that I'm on. And also I found out recently that you had a similar background to me, and that you were also an economist in a previous life. And I was wondering, for me, The Limits to Growth was kind of my entry point into collapse. Was there a moment when you also became collapse aware? And was it while you were an economist? I'm interested to know that.
The closest thing I have to one epochal moment where I started thinking about the worst case scenarios, about catastrophe, collapse, would have been in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Summit. I was reading a book by Michael Ines called 6 Degrees, and essentially goes through the impacts of climate change at every single degree Celsius temperature rise, all the way from 1 through to 6. And once you start to get towards 6 degrees, particularly at 5 and 6 degrees, the impacts become catastrophic and in some ways almost apocalyptic. And that was when I really started thinking about the worst case scenarios and thinking not just about collapse, but potentially even worse fates. And at the same time, I was also seeing how sclerotic and paralyzed geopolitics could be. And that in many ways made me think that maybe the worst case scenario is a lot more possible and plausible than we think. Before that, I'd already had some exposure to this. So I'd read the Limits to Growth report. I had done a bachelor which did what was called human ecology, which is kind of a mixture of geography and anthropology, more or less. And as part of that, we did a lot of environmental studies, including limits to growth and things like planetary boundaries, the Great Acceleration, etc. But it was really in 2009 that all this crystallized into awareness of just how bad things could get.
That's really interesting, because I was also at Copenhagen.
Really?
Still in my economist role. And I mean, I know that, ultimately the negotiations were kind of a failure, but I think I was still very much on that average trajectory that, we just need to, 2 degrees and we can do it. So it's interesting to hear that you're way ahead of me at that time already. I'd love to get into that more, because that's actually one of the points that I wanted to talk to you about, how economists kind of perceive things differently. But before we dive in, your book has been out for about a year now?
Roughly, yeah. It's been out since, July 31st was the release date in the UK. So getting very, very close to the anniversary.
Some people listening may have already read it or watched some interviews with you. But maybe for those who haven't, or just to give us a refresher, can you kind of give us a very brief synopsis of what are Goliaths and how are they cursed?
Goliaths, in a very simple way, are my alternative term for civilization. When you go to write a book on collapse, you have to ask, what is collapsing? And most people say civilization. And yet when I try to look at definitions of civilization, they're all really poor, ambiguous, and often pretty ideologically loaded. Things like an advanced culture, which I'm sure a lot of indigenous people wouldn't appreciate as a definition. Not to mention, it's just incredibly vague and nebulous.
Mm-hmm.
And Civilization has always been a term propaganda. It comes from Latin root civilitas, which means people who live in cities, but it also has these connotations of wisdom, moderation, virtue, restraint. When I looked empirically at what actually happens when people talk about the rise of civilization, it tends to be things like patriarchy, warfare, slavery, and human sacrifice. To me, Goliath was a much more appropriate term for what we see occurring here. And it's essentially a collection of dominance hierarchies, not just the state, but also the distinction between slave and master, rich and poor, man and woman. All of those together make up one Goliath. And Goliaths, in a very simple way, you can think of as being a system in which a small group extract resources from others using violence. And hence Goliath, as a biblical metaphor, really makes sense as well. It's referring to a being of great intimidating stature who rules through violence, but also surprisingly fragile. And the book, of course, is titled Goliath's Curse, the implication being that these Goliaths are cursed in some kind of way. And the curse is that they contain the seeds of their own demise. Goliaths at the time grow in wealth inequality. They have a really good empirical evidence that this is the case. This means they can reach staggering levels of wealth inequality. One study of 28 pre-modern states found that on average, 77% towards the maximum theoretical level of inequality. That maximum is a situation which essentially one person holds all the surplus wealth and everyone else has just enough to survive and reproduce on. And once you start to get to these high levels of wealth inequality, it spills into other forms of power. Politics becomes more oligarchic. The bureaucracy becomes more powerful. And you start to see a whole bunch of knock-on effects. We know that, for instance, corruption has a bidirectional relationship with wealth inequality. You start to see what some people call elite competition, what I call elite factionalism. Essentially, a large number of elites competing for a small number of high-status positions like thrones start to resort to things like coups, rebellions, etc. On top of that, as you have this burgeoning big elite class, they inflate the price of assets for everyone else, things like land, for instance. It's what you call popular immiseration, or what today we call a cost of living crisis. There's all these different knock-on effects, and I go through many of them. These also include things like environmental degradation. If you're trying to essentially placate everyone at home, one of the best ways of doing so is through material comforts extracted from your territory, or extracted from others through imperial overstretch. But essentially, wealth inequality and the concentration of power has all these knock-on effects that slowly hollow out the state until eventually it's torn asunder by a collection of different hazards, things like warfare, invaders, climate change. And in the book, I draw upon multiple large databases, including one I constructed myself, the Mortality of States Index. And I go through in detail about a couple of dozen case studies, but it's built upon analysis of hundreds. And while the book is mainly about collapse, it's really in many ways a radical re-envisioning of human history, a complete different take on how states evolve, what this has meant for human happiness, and what it also means for our future and for potential collapses in the future.
Okay, well, thank you for that wonderful overview. And I was frantically taking notes also because, well, there are so many lessons for today, right? And one of the points, and we kind of discussed this a little bit offline, is that economics is particularly sort of ahistoric in the kind of the models and the theories that it has. So things like, the elite accumulation, or the fact that, the inflation of asset prices, environmental degradation, these are all pretty important factors that kind of feel like, they feel, at least to me, and at least when I was learning economics and also working in the field, they kind of get somehow missed out or brushed over if you're just looking at kind of these kind of natural progressions of whether it's GDP or life expectancy, at least when we look at kind of recent history. The opening question that I have for kind of all our guests on this is, what is wrong with economics and the way that it is taught and practiced today? So maybe you can speak from your own experience, but also what you've learned more recently.
There's so many options to choose from. I'll have to nail it down to a couple. I'll just focus on three in this case. The first one is power. When you look at the very original economists, they were all political economists, whether it's Adam Smith, Karl Marx, David Hume, all of these people that didn't just think about economics as being the distribution, allocation of goods and services like we think of it today. It was about how this interacts with power. And to be frank, you can't understand economics unless you are thinking about power. I couldn't teach climate economics without talking about the fact that the fossil fuel industry has an incredible ability to influence, veto, and distort climate policy. You can't really talk about the history of carbon pricing without talking about things like the merchants of doubt, how the fossil fuel industries run misinformation, disinformation campaigns, essentially to successfully sow doubt in the science of climate change. This is the real reality of how money and power are exercised. And if you ignore that, you're ignoring over half the picture, to be frank. And I think this has been a cardinal sin of economics, particularly since the 1970s and 80s with the rise of neoliberalism. This is being corrected somewhat. There's a growing number of institutional economists and others who are trying to bring power back into the picture, but it's still something that you don't really get much of in first-year econ, whether it be macro or micro, or even in most specializations. That would be number one. I think the other one, number two, is simple assumptions which miss much of the world. And this is what feminist economists, ecological economists, etc., have all spoken about at great length. That if, for instance, you're not talking about unpaid labor, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And things like child rearing and cleaning actually make the world go round. If you take those away, then suddenly the economy collapses quite quickly. And yet those things aren't included in most calculations of GDP, for instance. And likewise, everything depends upon the services and provisions provided by the Earth. Everything is dependent upon the Earth system. And yet that usually isn't quantified. And if it was, of course, it would vastly outstrip GDP multiple times over. And because it's not quantified, it's never accounted for or actually included in economic calculations. These criticisms have been around for decades, and yet economics has done a pretty poor job at actually trying to either address them or bring them into the fold in some way. And apart from that, there's also just the fact that economics is based upon just really simple ideas of utility, for instance. It's a very utilitarian framework. Last but not least, I think economics has masqueraded as a hard science when it's not. And it has really big problems in actually trying to revise and update itself. You see when economists present their findings, their ideas, particularly when it comes to things like damages on climate change, they present these as numbers from models which are largely objective and in some cases almost infallible. That's the way they're presented. And that is, to be frank, absolute and utter bullshit. Most of these models that are used, they can't even predict GDP from last month or next month. And yet we're supposed to think these are providing highly accurate, high-resolution images of the economy and decades into the future, when we don't even know what geopolitics or the energy system looks like, and is then also having a high-fidelity image of what climate damages will be then. Once they actually start to be able to even do forecasting effectively in 1 year, I might take them a little more seriously. Just a little bit, maybe 2%. That still means they have very little accuracy in the space of decades into the future when it comes to climate change. And yet these have been used to provide really precise figures about how much damage climate change is going to cause. That is ludicrous. And unfortunately, no matter how many times these kind of criticisms are put forward by economists like Steve Keen, for instance, most of the field has been incredibly poor at actually trying to update itself. And as mentioned, the ideas of ecological economics, feminist economics, etc., have been around for a very long period of time. And again, the field has done a very, very bad job at actually trying to change itself. And perhaps this is just power corrupting, that when you have the ear of presidents and treasurers, you have less of a need to try to take the criticisms of others seriously. And indeed, admitting failure or admitting your models are not very effective at doing forecasting, that may diminish your ability to influence policy. But whatever the basis is, economics is the furthest thing you can have from a hard science. This is often why many economists do call it the dismal science, which, to be frank, it is.
Dismal, except when it comes to forecasting climate change, where then it looks actually quite rosy compared to your work. So I find just the irony. Yeah, and that's so that power dynamic in economics is ultimately what we're trying to get to with this series, right? So I think thanks for that. I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of our thinking with this as well. That it is the most influential science, right? So it's very hard to then sort of admit these mistakes. And I guess also because it is quite uniquely kind of insulated in a way from other sciences, whether from the social sciences or from your science. I don't know, can you talk to the kind of interactions that you might have with economists now that you're no longer in the field, so to speak?
So as a brief background, I had a Bachelor of Interdisciplinary Studies, where essentially you take units from every faculty across the university. And I majored in both political science and human ecology thereafter. But my PhD was quite mixed, and thereafter I lectured in climate change economics and policy. I ran a master's course on that back at the Australian National University, as well as international climate change econ and policy. And then I worked as an economist at Vivid Economics, which was a boutique environmental consultant in London. And to be frank, it was surprising how many economists I knew outside of academia didn't know most of the major critiques of economics. They didn't know the major critiques from ecological economics, for instance. Within academia, it was usually quite well known. And at least where I was at the Crawford School at the ANU, where you have people like Bob Costanza, who's one of the big figures trying to move beyond GDP, most of them usually were kind of non-neoclassical economists. They usually were aware of the shortcomings and had a very different approach. But outside of teaching, when you go to consultancies, people weren't really aware. They'd just usually done the basic macro and micros, etc., and specialize in econometrics or something else like that. And they weren't usually aware of either the history of the field or its limitations, which I found surprising. One thing to add here is that, interestingly, even when critique comes from within, it's rarely adopted in any kind of meaningful way. And two great examples here. One is the economist Ramsey, when he created the Ramsey equation, which is used for discounting. He explicitly says that discounting is ethically indefensible and arises from a lack of imagination. Despite that warning, we still use that discount rate quite prominently, even in major works on climate economics.
Yes.
And similarly, the calculation of gross domestic product, GDP, that was created by Kuznets as essentially a way to try to measure wartime mobilization ability, how many guns, tanks, and ships you could build. He was quite explicit, this is not a measurement of progress. Do not use this as a measurement of progress. Yet, decades later, everyone uses it as a measure of progress. So it's really interesting. I don't think it's even just insularity, or that is part of it. There is a kind of unique ideology. Once things are adopted, they become relatively immune to revision, even from within economics. And it's worth having the caveat here of hashtag not all economists. Of course, there's a very big church here, but we're really talking about the standard kind of neoclassical paradigm, which is dominant and it's taught in most universities.
Yeah. And maybe we can come back later to, I'd be interested in sort of reactions to parts of your book, especially when you talk, your critiques of growth and GDP or so on. But maybe to pick up on progress so something else that I'm sort of following as a kind of line of research in this work. And this derives from systems thinking, which I went down a complete rabbit hole on when I discovered limits to growth and Donella Meadows, and how mental models, right, are kind of at the basis of our understanding of systems and our understanding of the economy. And what I find interesting about your book is that it also attacks certain mental models. But I can think there are key mental models that I would think a lot of economists and maybe others, kind of the Steve Pinkers of the world, have a particular mental model of the economy and of progress in particular. And that might also lead them to kind of disregard other critiques that come in. I don't know what you think about that, or if you can speak a little bit more to the way that your book debunks certain myths around progress, if I put it that way.
I think the mental model that most economists have of progress, and indeed many people in general, is essentially a hockey stick. That things were terrible.
Right. Yeah.
They were really terrible. They got slightly better with the adoption of empires, civilization, if you will, Goliath, as I would say. They get better as Goliaths become more powerful. Then you had this huge skyrocketing with the Industrial Revolution. And this is what you see on most graphs from our world and data. And it's partially true, right? When you look at things like literacy, maternal mortality, infant mortality, these things have all improved dramatically over the last century or two. Mm-hmm. But there's lots of caveats here. And before we get to the caveats, it's worth noting that this hockey stick is also related to a deeper worldview, which is essentially that hierarchy and technology good. These are the key ingredients that make human life better. And the improvement of human life can and should be measured largely in terms of material standard of living. Part of that, I think, is a measurement problem. And this is always a classic critique of economists, that they're always searching for, like the drunk looking in the light for the keys, even though they know they lost the keys elsewhere. They're always looking to just focus on the things that are measurable and easily measurable. This, for me, was actually one of the reasons I wrote the book. I realized that when people think about the future, when they think about existential risk or collapse, they always have a vision of the past in their head. They have assumptions about the grand history of humanity and even human nature. And I wanted to make sure that if I was doing that, it was done on the most rigorous empirical basis possible. Once you actually look empirically into macro history, this idea of the hockey stick really starts to falter. In the book, for instance, I look at 3 measurements we could have of human progress. Of course, the term is very tricky, but most of us agree that better health, in general, a higher standard of living, and being happier are all good things. And none of those really follow the hockey stick model that well, necessarily. For instance, if you're looking at human health, it's really hard to find a good quantifier for that across human history, but the best one we have is human height, which is a good overall biophysical indicator of how well you're fed, whether you're getting access to good exercise, whether you have been exposed to disease or famine, in general, your overall health. And we find that when you have the intensification of agriculture, as people give up hunting and gathering and pick up the plow, they lose a couple of inches in height. It's pretty catastrophic for the human condition as far as we can tell. They start to get more dental caries as well, more holes in their teeth. Their bones become weaker. They start to get more bone lesions. And you even start to get deformities. For instance, women often have these deformities in the knees and ankles, essentially from rocking back and forth, kneading dough. All of that happens with agriculture. And then interestingly, after agriculture, for the next 5,000 years or so, you more or less see a stagnation in human height. There's some variations. Interestingly, often after collapse, people get taller. We can go into that later. But it's more or less staying within a pretty narrow bandwidth. It isn't until after the Industrial Revolution you start to get a takeoff. Similar story with standard of living. It's really hard to quantify this to hunter-gatherers, of course, but when you start to look at pre-modern states, you can start to look at how much grain the average person earned in a year. And the funny thing is, it doesn't actually change that much between an Egyptian peasant 8,000 years ago and an English peasant a couple of hundred years ago. They have a pretty similar level of income overall, which is just astounding that human height, human health, and your standard of living just don't change that much despite the adoption of things like shipping, the sail, mirrors, the iron plow, all these different windmills, water mills, all these different big technological innovations, and yet they don't seem to dramatically improve the human condition. This does change once you get the Industrial Revolution. But interestingly, it's not with the Industrial Revolution, and this is key to remember. The Industrial Revolution initially is horrible for everyone who's involved. In the core of Britain, you have both a drop in human height, you have a drop in life expectancy, and you have these horrendous stories of children dying en masse in these factories, which are often referred to as satanic mills, with good reason. It isn't until you start to get these big social movements, suffragettes, unionists, even anarchists, who push for things like the 8-hour working day, the 40-hour week. Suddenly, you start to get change. That's when you start to see the liftoff of all these different big indicators. That tells a very different story to the typical hockey stick. It's not one of hierarchy and technology equals progress. Quite to the contrary, technology, most of the benefits have usually been eaten up by a small elite across history. And that's why you don't see this flow on to things like human height. Instead, you start to get shared prosperity when you have essentially both social movements that demand change, that demand for the fruits of technology to be widely shared. And of course, yes, you do have some technological change in a positive direction. But that's a very different story. And last but not least, I'll touch briefly upon happiness, which I think is the most alarming and surprising of the results I found. which simply put, hunter-gatherers appear to be happier than their industrial counterparts. Happiness is really hard to measure. There's multiple ways of doing so, and we can't go back in time and ask a citizen of Rome or the Han Dynasty whether or not they're happy, and if so, how much. But what we can do is we can look at modern nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers who lead similar-ish lifestyles to people during the Paleolithic. And we find from studies comparing, for instance, the Hadza to people from Spain as well as the US, that they are actually quite happy. And this actually matches the ethnography we have, the accounts from ethnographers and anthropologists, hunter-gatherers, that they seem to be pretty happy. They spend a lot of the time singing and dancing, socializing. And a lot of this does make sense. When you look at the studies we have on happiness, they tend to come to the conclusion that things like your social contacts, your basic health, so if you're getting a good amount of exercise, sleep, you're having a varied diet, all of these things make quite a big difference to your overall happiness. And these are all things that hunter-gatherers, nomadic egalitarian ones at least, have in abundance. So it's a kind of interesting story where despite this apparent hockey stick, when you look at it overall, most people may actually be sadder and actually shorter than people during the Paleolithic.
When you were talking about the hockey stick there, so one of the things, I guess, if I was an economist, I might say it was technology. It was things like the Green Revolution. That's one of the big critiques against also the limits to growth, was that, you've overlooked the fact that we can now feed so many people. So how does that sort of fit in with what we're seeing here? And maybe also interestingly, things like social movements are never there. They're not there in the econometric models, at least not the models that I was working with. And how does that fit in with this hockey stick?
So again, innovation actually can be a good thing. Inventions can be a good thing. I think it's great that the world has access to vaccines and high-speed rail. These are good things that we shouldn't take back. But when you look at many of the things that are touted as being huge advances for humanity, it often depends upon how you measure it, because there are externalities for many of these things. If you counted up the externalities of social media, I don't think it's probably been a net benefit for human society. Maybe the internet even hasn't been, to be frank. It's hard to tell, but we don't usually count up these externalities. We're measuring things in a highly biased way. And that makes it difficult to know whether or not technologies actually have been a good thing overall. And I think this goes for the Green Revolution to a large extent as well. Yes, it lifted a huge number of people out of poverty and allowed for a much larger population on Earth as well. But there's a question, of course, of how sustainable is that in the long term. But there's also just interesting questions of what are the knock-on effects and the externalities. I think it could still very well end up being a net positive, but the important thing is the externalities are often not calculated into these things. So until you start to have a more holistic picture and include externalities, and until you start to have a more accurate, realistic picture of what happens across history, I think it's really hard to sell this idea of the hockey stick as being a realistic picture of what happens to human progress long term. And again, this is like a partial qualification of technology and innovation can be good. Part of that story is correct, but only under certain conditions, which, as you mentioned, are usually ignored by economists. Again, a caveat of hashtag not all economists. There are some, Dan Akemoglu being a great example, where they have tried to think much more about the role of power in determining things like shared prosperity. His book, Power and Progress, being a fantastic example alongside James Robinson.
Mm-hmm. Yes, agree. Yeah, absolutely. This is not a critique of all economists, but unfortunately the vast majority are in that neoclassical framework, which I guess brings me to the reason why, I just thought about the Green Revolution there, because that is often something that gets thrown in, and maybe also just for people who don't know what I'm talking about here, this is the synthesizing of fertilizers using the Hager-Bosch principle to create this vast increase in yields, but it was kind of a short-term boost, right? Because it has come with a lot of externalities, as you say, which brings us to, the planetary boundaries, right? Which you mention a lot in your work. And we're now past sort of 7 from 9 planetary boundaries. And many of those in biodiversity and what's happening in our oceans and on land are linked actually to agriculture. So we're starting to see the feedbacks of this sort of hockey stick of growth and increase in nutrition now sort of coming back to bite us in terms of degrading our planet. So to sort of link that maybe then to this topic of of risk, right? So not seeing where these then externalities might take us. Because I think as well, something that I find quite wild is, just back in the 70s, we really hadn't passed many of these boundaries. So we were still at that up of the hockey stick, but we hadn't started to really see the ecological feedbacks at a global level of where that might be taking us. And we're now there, and yet we're still in a situation where the narrative is still kind of, we can grow our way out of this. So like coming back to kind of risk and uncertainty, because your work is around existential risk. You use this example in the book of Russian roulette. I wonder if you could kind of explain the way that you think about risk and uncertainty versus, I guess, the way that economists and maybe others that are looking at that hockey stick are not thinking about it, and maybe to help our listeners to understand, the shortcomings of economics and the way that it is influencing so much of our decision making, right? By not having that perception of risk and uncertainty that I think your work brings in and others bring in.
One good example of trying to think through this is Steven Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature. Pinker in this book has the idea that essentially we've been on this grand arc towards peace, that over time humans, through the civilizing process and things like the Enlightenment, have become more peaceful and less prone to violence, both at an interpersonal level, but also at the mass scale of things like warfare. And he marshals a large amount of empirical data and statistics, often very poorly, to be frank. There's a great paper called Pinker's List by Brian Ferguson, which essentially tears apart the data he uses for trying to estimate violence during the ice ages, during the Paleolithic. And he's right about some things, he's wrong about other things. So, for instance, he thinks that during the Paleolithic, we probably had a lethal violence rate of 15%. In other words, for every 100 people born, 15 would die at the hands of another human being. When you actually look at the very best archaeological, anthropological, and genetic evidence, it's probably closer to 2%, frankly, probably even lower than that. And he is right that once you go to states and empires, you do interestingly see this decline in violence over the long term. It's really clear cut that if you're a citizen living 5,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago in a Mesopotamian empire, you are at a far higher likelihood of being stabbed or clubbed to death than you are today living in, frankly, most countries, but particularly large-scale industrialized countries. But there's a really important big caveat here. There was no weapon on Earth that could kill over half the population 4,000 years ago. Today we have them. We have nuclear weapons. And the best models we have right now of estimating what could happen if you have a full-scale nuclear war between the US and Russia and the ensuing effects of nuclear winter and how that impacts crop yields is that this could kill, primarily through starvation, 5 billion people. That's well over half the global population. And all it takes is one bad day, and suddenly the statistics on violence look very different today. Suddenly we're not living through the most peaceful epoch. It's quite the contrary. Yeah. And this is what Pinker and many others really miss, is they're only focusing upon the observed and not upon risk that has yet to be realized. And this is really important. If, say, for instance, you have a neighbor who is like pretty peaceful except for that one time they've gone out and killed 33 people, you wouldn't be like, yeah, he's a really, really peaceful, cool guy. Like that one event really skews the distribution, but also your perception of the character. And likewise here, again, all it takes is one particular event, whether it's a nuclear war or something like a large-scale collapse of the food system due to the impacts of climate change, multiple other things, to change the entire narrative very, very quickly. And you can't just ignore that from the calculations. You can't ignore tail risk. These need to be things that you think about as well. And unfortunately, and strangely, Pinker is aware of these things in his book, but he just chooses to brush them aside, I guess because they're inconvenient for his argument. But Pinker is just, I don't want to pick up on him too much because he is just the most well-known, emblematic voice of this perspective. But there's lots of people who do this as well. And it's very prevalent in the narrative of everything is getting better, is to ignore all the risks like sort of Democracies that are hanging over our heads.
And you don't kind of hold back in the book. about just the many, many risks, from nuclear or to also, automated AI weapons. But even with those aside, right, we have the slow moving but exponentially increasing risk of climate and ecological collapse, which is on the horizon right now. I mean, the risk of the AMOC collapsing is there, but it's not in the models. I actually just looked up, because you were talking about GDP, I looked up the forecasts from a couple of banks and Goldman Sachs and the World Bank, and they're all forecasting the global economy to double, by 2050. But as you say, that just completely overlooks the fact there are all these possible risks in the pipeline. On the technology point, I think what was really important in the book and I guess kind of empowering in a way is that you talk about kind of the myth of progress and the fact that progress only came with this collective struggle. So particularly when we think about risks now, whether it's nuclear, whether it's AI. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's something that also sort of gets brushed over in this kind of technology was good for everyone narrative.
As mentioned, you don't tend to see technology being good for everyone until you actually have everyone taking to the streets and demanding that the fruits of technology be shared widely. I mentioned that despite technological change, you don't really see this factor into things like human height, median wages, etc. And this appears to be by and large because elites are eating up most of the benefits. And interestingly, there's actually some case studies where, say, for instance, I think it was the Mexican basin in Mexico after the conquest by the Spanish, you had price controls on workers. And as soon as those were relaxed, worker wages basically shot up. So a lot of this ends up being essentially how much the elites were taking with the surplus. And it's just pretty clear cut that if you look towards the future and you have AI automating large parts of the economy, and you don't have large-scale social movements or really deep democratic systems that are demanding that the benefits of the capital be widely shared, then you're probably going to end up in just very, very dark autocracies. There's a finding across much of history that when you have states that are aligned upon revenue from their citizens, they're much more likely to be democratic. In short, because they have to negotiate with their citizens. Those who are aligned upon external sources of revenue, they tend to be far more autocratic. What you're doing with AI is you're more or less shifting that balance much more towards capital, away from labor, and essentially towards external sources of revenue, if you will. And we see this throughout history really clearly, even when it comes to modern history. We often talk about the rise of representative democracies. And this is in large part because you had large numbers of people who were better educated. They realized the economy was dependent upon their workforce. And additionally, they were often armed. That changed the balance of power between elites and commoners. And elites essentially had to provide a whole bunch of concessions. Most of the things that we take for granted in social democracies, they were won because of that power balancing. AI would essentially change that entirely. It would shift power much more back towards capital and towards elites. And the great travesty, of course, is these are machines of collective intelligence. They're built upon all our data. They have been trained on years of research compiled mainly at universities. Yes, some of the big breakthroughs recently have been in corporations, but much of the foundational research prior to that was at universities. These should be owned by everyone, not just by a small number of venture capitalists. And this is the dark thing going forwards, unfortunately, is if we do have this view of technology de facto equaling progress, it is going to lead to, I think, a very dystopian future.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned capitalism.
I did.
I was wondering, reading your book, well, because one thing that I'm finding in our research into economics is that, and I don't know if you recall this from learning economics yourselves, that we don't really talk about capitalism. It's just kind of there in the background. It's just assumed to be, it's the model of progress, right? We also don't talk about the struggle, and we could, also mention the fact now that since the 1970s, that struggle has been under pressure from neoliberal policies that have undermined labour and undermined other potential social movements, the impact of IMF policies in the global south and how they often literally demand weakening labour protections, weakening social protections that might actually provide that struggle against these forces that we're talking about. So I was wondering, given that your book has been so widely read and congratulations, and it's not surprising because it is an absolute, achievement. But you are quite critical of capitalism, quite directly as well. Being a model, and I should say for definition, for those that don't know it, my definition would be it's about owning the means of production, right? And in particular, having property rights. So not that democratic ownership and that, which would be a deep beyond sort of representative democracy, actually the workers and communities owning the means of production, having a say in things like technology. So I was just wondering, have you had feedback on that aspect from your book? What do people say? Because you've had interviews and spoken with many different audiences.
There hasn't been too much feedback. Interestingly, the main pushback I've had has been essentially from Marxists saying, no, the problem is not Goliath, the problem is capitalism. And
right.
I try to take interestingly, I try to take a nuanced perspective in the book, pointing out that you had big environmental impacts and you had arms races well before the advent of what we typically call capitalism. And there's multiple different definitions of capitalism. You can take this tick box affair where you talk about things like the presence of wage-based labor, private ownership of capital, markets that are supportive of our private ownership of capital, etc. And most of these are more or less visible in very early pre-modern societies. So even in the late Bronze Age, for instance, you had essentially multinational corporations who had private capital and were essentially using wage-based labor to more or less increase the amount of capital they had. But when you're really looking at capitalism the way you think of it today, an entire economic system of private ownership that is looking for perpetual growth, that is something which is, quite modern, right? It's more or less, some people put it back to the long 16th century, some people more to the Industrial Revolution, but it's something that is usually within the last few centuries. And interestingly, even when you look at economies which aren't particularly capitalist, like the Soviet Union still produced the world's largest nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union still wreaked enormous amounts of environmental destruction. So I do think capitalism is really important here, particularly its ability to supercharge material processing and the construction of things like advanced weaponry and technology through that positive feedback loop of get capital so you can get more capital. That's really powerful. That's really important. But I don't think it's necessarily the root of, I think that's something much closer to what I identify as Goliath or dominance hierarchies. So it's a bit more of a nuanced picture. I do still have people who hate the book purely because I see it as being left-wing and being an anti-capitalist tirade, which I find funny when you're getting both flack from the left and the right, but so be it. It probably means you're not doing a bad job. And it's also worth noting that the book is sometimes accused of being me projecting my values onto global history. And I find that really funny just because I didn't really hold most of these values until actually researching the book, and it really changed my perspective and my values as well. Actually, two things we should briefly touch upon as well, which were mentioned earlier in the conversation. One is this question of technological innovation, and can it get us out of all the different big risks we face? Can we use things like stratospheric aerosol injection, solar geoengineering to solve climate change? Can we have technological fixes to AI, to nuclear weapons, etc.? And in many ways, the criticism of limits to growth, the main one leveled by economists, was don't worry, technological innovation will save the day. And that's not adequately factored into your model. It's really interesting because when you look at it, it ends up being essentially an insoluble debate because you can't really prove or disprove that innovation can take us all the way to the stars. It can solve every problem. Sure, there's a chance of that, maybe, but it is really a very large-scale gamble with the future of humanity. And when you view it that way, it's the economists who actually look like the speculative, starry-eyed gamblers. They're the ones who aren't being very realistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And weirdly, it's people who usually fall more in the kind of realm of degrowth, etc., are often labeled as being unpragmatic, etc. They're the ones who are actually being really quite grounded and realistic. They're taking biophysical reality as is and not willing to throw the dice with technology. But as mentioned, this is also something which we can't really ever fully determine. I think it's important to bear in mind that our very best ways of forecasting the future, what are called super forecasters, that method has very little accuracy beyond a year. And I think there are ways and certain things that you can better understand in the longer durée. And in the book, for instance, I try to look at what are robust trends across history and what can this tell us about the future. So for instance, across almost every Goliath, every polity in human history, you've had this cycle of wealth inequality increasing over time. And unless you have really big corrective measures, that will and is happening again. So there are ways and things you can kind of predict the future on roughly, but making really discrete predictions, really, really difficult. And hence saying something like innovation is always going to occur and can essentially solve all the problems. It's a very, very big bet, and one that I personally would not take.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that, because I did want to touch on it. And I think added to that on the innovation side, so there are some like maybe very short term things that we could do, like you say, geoengineering could put the planes up probably tomorrow, right? And you might get a quick fix there. It wouldn't do anything to change the structure of our economies and how we're making things, and all the other problems that we've got in the pipeline is one element. But other elements, and I think this is where I also found economic models to be really just wrong in the way that they're constructed. If you think about the climate economic models, like for example, from William Nordhaus, or the discounting rate, which makes it look like instead of acting early to prevent the risks, you can wait until we're rich enough and then sort of quickly come in. And a lot of the technologies are not ready that quickly. Think about the discussion now about small nuclear reactors, which are always seem to me just on the horizon, but they're not quite there yet. And then maybe in 5 years and maybe in 10 years. And we know that it only takes, if they're not there when we need them to be there, or if there's public pushback or whatever, or maybe some geopolitical tensions, we're not going to be able to make the emissions reductions that these technologies promise. So for me as well, in the economic models, and I think it's embedded in things I spoke with Steve Keen about, like the production function, where you can just sort of in an instant sort of change the inputs and suddenly you get a different output. That's not how it works. Our economies are structurally tethered to reality, and it takes a long time often to get these technologies at the scale that they would need them. So and those bets are getting increasingly risky as so many problems are coming at us. So it feels to me like this argument is somehow getting weaker and weaker. And yet I feel like with AI has just created a new way to make the same arguments as basically were being made back when the Limits to Growth was published.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing where so many economic models end up being essentially tautologies. You're determining the result by the assumptions you plug in. And many integrated assessment models, IAMs, are exactly like this. And Steve Keen would have discussed this as well. If you look at the original DICE model by William Nordhaus, you can basically collapse the entire economy by turning up the damage function as high as possible. And yet it immediately rebounds because labor factor productivity is so high that people just apparently in the wake of collapse are immediately rebuilding the economy the next day. And there's not really much you can do about that. Just the assumption is a really bad one and is biased you towards a very clear outcome. There's a really clear example of this as well in my field of existential risk, the study of the very worst case catastrophes that could lead to global societal collapse or human extinction. There was a economics wunderkid so Leopold Aschenbrenner, he was sponsored by a very famous economist called Tyler Cowen, who's renowned for the Marginal Revolution, this very popular blog. He's now the kind of figurehead of what's called progress studies, which is essentially the study of how do you increase GDP? Because, of course, that can be used as a synonym for progress, as Kuznets would remind us, right? In short, Leopold put together this model where he assumed that past a certain point of income, people start to care more about existential risk. They're going to go on the streets and campaign about nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And so hence, lo and behold, the question of does growth result in higher or lower existential risk, it ends up being lower because you have this Kuznets effect where it increases initially and then you get past that point, people go to the streets. No. How else do you end up with that result if that's your assumption you're plugging into the model? You can forget all the differential equations and mathematics. All you've done is literally write a qualitative statement of, if this is true, this will happen. You could have made this entire paper into one sentence. But if you hide it behind a model, you can make it seem far more persuasive, far more objective, and you can actually get it published in a very high-level journal. And I think this is a really big problem we have in the academy, actually, is that as soon as you formalize things in mathematics, it automatically makes it more reputable and more likely to be published. And this is something which I think Bill Nordhaus has shown dramatically well. He influenced the development of an entire field. He influenced the numbers we use even to this day around climate damages through the use of models which have absolutely zero credibility and absolutely zero ability to talk about and predict the damages of climate change. They are, to be frank, just formalized bullshit. He made up some assumptions and plugged them into a mathematical framework. And as an economist, that's actually the biggest thing I took from my background, was once I understood how to look under the hood of some of the models, I became really skeptical of most of these. There's some better ones out there, but in general, most just aren't very good.
Yeah.
And this is unfortunately what I think happens often when we talk about things like innovation, the long-term future. As you mentioned, the idea that GDP is going to double despite all the threats we face, is they're often just based upon very poor models that are used because of convention and not because of logic or evidence. And this is exactly the same kind of thinking, which also posits that, don't worry, technological innovation is going to be a good thing overall. And the other problem here is you're often ignoring that technological innovation creates new problems and new threats. So even if you do think that the way forward is taking the gamble, you have to also bear in mind that you're taking the gamble of creating other new problems and threats. All the things that we really study in the field of X-risk, whether it be nuclear weapons, engineered pandemics, artificial intelligence, these are all things that are being created by technology. And when we look to the future, things like quantum computing, mirror life, these are new threats that are once again being created by a very small number of people inventing very dangerous products. And this is, I think the key is, once again, you have to think about power. If you're just focusing upon technology here, you're getting less than half the picture. It's going to bias you towards outcomes and actions which frankly could endanger the entire world.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, but I would wanted to ask if you have time for one or two more questions. I usually ask as well, thank you. I usually ask as well our guests what specifically you're working on now, and then maybe as a final question as well, if you have any feedback for people that are listening, or indeed for our project and in what we can do. But I will let you take those questions as you wish, in the order you wish.
Let's start with, what am I doing now? I'm working on a second book, which is called Mass Surveillance, The History and Future of Being Watched. And this is in many ways similar in scope and approach and ambition as the first book, but rather than looking at collapse, looking at mass surveillance. I was largely spurred to take on this topic by researching the first book, where I end by talking about the different trajectories going forward. And one, of course, is self-termination. It is global societal collapse. Another is emancipation. And a third one, and I think the most likely, particularly in the short term, is what I call Silicon Goliath. A system in which you essentially have almost total control and surveillance under the auspices and control of a very small number of intelligence agencies and corporations. And we're already heading there pretty quickly. And I'm actually fast-tracking this book because of exactly that reason, that this is something which, particularly because of AI, is moving forward much more rapidly than I would have expected. It's worth noting that the National Security Agency, the NSA, it already has 2 billion times more data than the Stasi ever had access to. Their bottleneck was always the fact they couldn't have enough analysts to pass through and understand and analyze all the data. Now they probably do with AI systems. And things are only going to get a bit worse, unfortunately, from here. So I do think this is actually one of the biggest problems we face. And if mass surveillance becomes powerful enough to target key people who are going to lead any kind of resistance or protest movements, for instance, suddenly that becomes a way of preventing emancipation, or preventing mass movements, and preventing progress, essentially.
Yeah.
And alongside then also starting a organization, which, working on the name, but it could be something like Center for a Human Future, which is essentially going to be putting forward a blueprint for how you democratize society. How do you have citizens' assemblies and juries applied throughout society, not just for one policy decision, but how you essentially, in many ways, do Athens like it should have been at scale. Athens is really intriguing insofar as it does have this very intense version of democracy where you select people at random, the boule, as it's called. You also have these large assemblies, the ecclesia. But Athens is also limited. It's limited to 15% of the population, mainly just land-holding males. And despite that, it still ends up being pretty exceptional. It's one of the few times in history where the median wage actually gets higher, even for the slaves, or median standard of living, I should say. And on top of that, you actually start to see wealth inequality stagnating and reversing. Imagine if you could have that alongside the cultural flourishing, but at scale across the entire world. not only would that be a better world, but I think you would also see most of the big problems we have, whether it be nuclear weapons, the development of AI, etc., would change quite radically and dramatically. So this organization would be essentially looking at how do you do it at scale, but then also in particular trying to apply it to and push for this to be done on AI. I think AI going forward is going to be one of the wedge issues. People hate AI. They trust big tech less than Congress, which is really hard to do. And that's impressive right there. And I think that's an opportunity. In terms of lessons for you guys, I'm not sure if I really have any big ones at this stage. I think you're doing really important work and, we each have a role to play here. So I would say if you can try to also look at the economics of AI as well and the way that economics, I think, is often being justified to enable the dreams of big tech billionaires and essentially just to justify huge amounts of speculative venture capital being poured into these things. Again, economics is part of that picture. It's not just simply Elon Musk being a good salesman.
Yeah. Thank you. We will definitely take that on board. Thank you for your time, Luke, and for all the work you're doing. This was really fascinating. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. I really enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to Invisible Handcuffs, Unchaining Economics, hosted by me, Katie Shields, with music, art and production by Philip Melchers. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking and following us on YouTube or your favourite podcasting platform, and by subscribing on our website at invisiblehandcuffs.com, where you can also find the show notes to this episode and more about the project. With that, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next time.